Hello, in this video tutorial we're going to be talking about problems involving percentages. Okay, so what is it that we'll cover today? Firstly, we're going to learn the 10%, 5%, 1% and 2% method, which is going to help you with a whole range of percentage questions. And then after that, we're going to use that method to find percentages of amounts and look at some word problems that involve using that skill. Okay, so to begin with, let's take a look at how we find 10%, 5%, 1% and 2% of any number. Okay, so the way we do this is take a look at the table. We've got the number 400, and what we're going to do is find 10%, 5%, 1% and 2% of it, and then we're going to do the same for 240, and then we're going to talk about why this is a useful technique, how it is that it can help us solve so many types of percentage-based problems. Okay, so let's start off with 400. How do we find 10% of 400? Now, to find 10% of any number, we simply divide that number by 10. Now, dividing 400 by 10 is pretty straightforward, okay? But it might be the case that you're working with a trickier number. So the best way to look at it, if ever you needed to divide by 10, is to place a decimal point at the end of the number, like this, and move it once to the left. Okay, so if we grab that, move it once to the left, what are we left with? 40.0, or just 40. Okay, so that's how we divide any number by 10. What we shouldn't say is, let's go back, let's write the number 400 down again. What we shouldn't say is to divide by 10 is we just remove the 0. I hear that a lot from students, and that's not a great way of remembering how to divide by 10 because not every number ends with 0. So let's remember the decimal point method. Okay, if the number already has a decimal point, we simply move it to the left. Okay, so we have found 10% of 400, we know that it's 40. And now we're going to find 5%. Okay, now if 10% of 400 is 40, listen to this bit really carefully because this bit's really important. 5% is half of 10%, or 10% divided by 2 is 5%. So there's a relationship between 10% and 5%, isn't there? 10% is double 5%, or 5% is half of 10%. So all we need to do here is just halve the value of 40. If we halve 40, we're going to get the value of 5%. So what is half of 40, or what is 40 divided by 2? It's 20. Okay, so now we know what 5% is. What about 1%? How are we going to figure out 1%? There's a number of things we can do here, okay? Again, we're thinking about relationships between numbers. So either we can get 10% and divide it by 10, because 10% divided by 10 is 1%. Or we can get 5% and divide it by 5, because 5% divided by 5 is 1%. It's all about number relationships, okay? Finding relationships between numbers, and that's what's going to help us find percentages very, very quickly. So what is it we should do? Well, what I'm going to do is, if I know that 10% is 40, to find 1%, I'm just going to get 40 and divide it by 10. Okay, so how do I do that? Well, we're going to use a technique we used earlier. 40 divided by 10, well, to divide any number by 10, we put a decimal point at the end and move it one place to the left. So it becomes 4.0, or just 4. Okay, so 1% must be 4. And finally, we're going to move on to 2%. Now, once again, we're thinking about the relationships between numbers. Take a look at 1%. If we double 1%, we get 2%. So all I need to do is double 4, or 4 times 2. What is 4 times 2? 4 times 2 is 8. And now I found 10%, 5%, 1% and 2% of 400. Now the reason this is important is because not only have I found 4 different percentage amounts of 400, but I can use this information to find any percentage of 400. For example, let's say that I want to find 6% of 400. all I need to do is get 5%, which is 20, and 1%, which is 4, and add them together. And look how quickly I found 6% of 400. Okay, let's do one more. If I want to find, let's change the question now, let's make it a bit trickier. How about we want to find 41% of 400? What could I do in this case? Well, let's first start by finding 40%. To find 40%, I can do 10% times 4, which would be 40 times 4. What's 40 times 4? That's 160. So that's 40%. And 1%, well, it's already written down for us, is 4. So 160 plus 4. So 41% must be 164. So just by finding 10%, 5%, 1%, and 2% of 400, it's allowed me to find any percentage of 400. Okay? So it's completely up to you. But if you're feeling up to the challenge, feel free to pause the video and have a go at finding 10%, 5%, 1%, and 2% of 240, and then resume the video when you are done to see if you're correct. Or if you prefer, you can keep watching and we'll do it together right now. Okay, so how do we find 10% of 240? Now remember, to find 10% of any number, decimal point at the end, and move it one place to the left. So let's read that. That's going to say 24.0, which is the same as just saying 24. Okay, so let's write that down. 10% of 240 must be 24. How do I find 5% of 240? Well, remember, 5% is half of 10%. So I just need to halve 24, which is 12. Okay, things are going to get a little bit trickier here, but not too much trickier. And that is, I now need to find 1%. And remember, 10% divided by 10 gives us 1%. So I need to do 24 divided by 10. So if you're a bit unsure here, think about this very carefully. 24 divided by 10. Remember, we can always stick a decimal point at the end and just move it one place to the left. Let's mentally read that. I won't do the actual moving. Let's see if we can imagine what that says in our heads. It would say 2.4. And then finally, to find 2%, we just need to double 1%. So 2.4 times 2 is 4.8. Okay, and now we found 10%, 5%, 1%, and 2% of 240. Okay, so now what we're going to do is look at some word problems which will be easier to solve if we use the method that we've just spoken about. Okay, so a school assembly has 220 students seated. When I'm reading through word problems, I like to underline numbers. It just helps me sort of process it quicker and know what it is I'm dealing with, okay? So a school assembly has 220 students seated. 20% of the students are wearing a gold tie and the rest are wearing a navy tie. How many students are wearing a gold tie? How many students are wearing a navy tie? Let's work this out. Okay, so we've got 220 students overall. And in this second line of this question here, it says 20% of the students are wearing a gold tie. Let's forget about everything else for a second. Let's just focus on that bit. 20% of the students are wearing a gold tie. So we've got to find 20% of the total number of students, which is 220, right? So how are we going to find 20% of 220? Let's use our technique, okay? So what would 10% of 220 be? Can you imagine a decimal point at the end of that number? Right here? And move it one place to the left? What would it say? It would say 22, wouldn't it? So 10% must be 22, but we're not looking for 10%. The question asks us to find 20%, okay? So what is 20%? Well, 20% is double 10%. just like 20 is double 10. So all I need to do is double this value here, double the 22, and that's going to give me 44. So I know that 20% is equal to 44. So take a look at this question again. It says a school assembly has 220 students seated. Let's get rid of that. 44 of the students are wearing a gold tie and the rest are wearing a navy tie. How many students are wearing a gold tie? We know, we've already worked it out, it's 44. And the rest are wearing a navy tie. There are two things we could do here to figure out how many are wearing a navy tie. We know it's the rest, so what we could do is we could do 220 students overall, subtract 44, because that's how many are wearing a gold tie, and that will give us the rest. The rest, because the rest are wearing the navy tie. Or, if we know 20% of the students are wearing a gold tie, it would mean that 80%, because 20 and 80 makes a whole, makes 100%, it would mean that 80% must be wearing the navy tie. So what we could do instead is we could use our new technique and find 80% of 220. It doesn't matter which method you've used. We've already used the method to figure out that 44 are wearing the gold tie. So whatever you're more comfortable with. But the answer in any case is going to be 176. Okay, let's take a look at another word problem. Class 6B has 30 students and 20% of them are in the school choir. Class 6C has 25 students and 40% of them are in the school choir. How many students from both classes combined are in the school choir? Okay, so we know what it is we need to do. We've been given two classes, we've been given some amounts and some percentages, and we need to figure out how many students combined in those two classes are in the school choir. So let's break it down one step at a time. So we've got a class 6B, which has 30 students and 20% of them are in the school choir. So let's do that bit first. We've got 30 students and 20% of 30 are in the school choir. Well, what's 10% of 30? 10% of 30 is going to be 3. We're looking for 20%. So we just need to double the values. Okay, so double 3 is 6. So class 6B has 30 students and 6 of them are in the school choir. We know that is correct. Okay, we've worked it out. Let's move on to the next step. The next step says class 6C has 25 students. So let's write that number down here. 25 students and 40% of them are in the school choir. 40%. Okay, so we'll use the same technique as usual. So we've got 10% of 25. What's 25 divided by 10? Remember, decimal point at the end, move it one step to the left. It's going to be 2.5. Now we're looking for 40%. We're not looking for 10%. So what do we need to do? We need to multiply 2.5 by 4, which is going to be 10. So I can get rid of this and replace it with 10. And now my answers are literally written on the screen. I just need to combine them. I've got 6 from class 6B. I've got 10 from class 6C. So altogether, there are 16 students combined from both classes. Alright, this is the final question of this video. So the Jones family want to buy a car that originally costs £4,000. So I know that £4,000 is an important number, an important value. They negotiate a 15% discount because the car has a scratch. Okay, so this is why vocabulary is important across the entire exam, because we need to know that discount means a reduction in the price. In other words, the £4,000 is going to be reduced by 15%. Okay, you can probably infer that as well because the car has a scratch, so it's likely that the price would be reduced. Okay, so how are we going to solve this? Well, we'll solve it how we've solved every question so far. We've got 4,000 or £4,000, and we want to find 15% of it. So what is 10%? Well, 10% of 4,000 is going to give us 400. What's 5%? Okay, well, 5% is half of 10%. So I need to find half of 400, which is 200. Now, I have enough information on the screen to find 15% because I found 10% and I found 5%. So if I combine them both, I get 15%. Okay, so what's 400 plus 200? That's 600 or £600. But be careful with the wording of this problem. Okay, we've now found 15%, but the answer isn't £600 because the question tells us that the discount is £600. In other words, the car is reduced by £600. This isn't the new cost of the car. This is the value of the discount. Okay, so we need to take £600 away from £4,000. What are we going to get? We are going to get £3,400. Okay, if you would like to practice more questions based on percentages, please take a look at the description and click on the link. And for other tutorials and live lessons, please head over to 11plushub.com.